Thank you, Fred, for moderating, and to our panelists, to all of you for participating, and to the Nashua Chamber for hosting this event. Every day, Granite Staters put aside differences to solve problems, and that is the example that I've sought to follow in the United States Senate. We all know that in New Hampshire, small businesses drive our economy, and they are the backbones of our community. And that's why I have worked throughout my time in the Senate to really push to give small businesses every chance for success. Let me give you a few examples. I led the successful effort in the Senate to double the research and development tax credit, the federal tax credit. I was one of the lead negotiators in the bipartisan infrastructure bill, helping us rebuild our crumbling roads and bridges, expanding high-speed internet to every corner of the state, and finally, hopefully, getting passenger rail to Nashua and even beyond. I also was an author of the Bipartisan Chips and Science Act. That is going to lower costs, bring supply chains and manufacturing back to the United States, help us build the kind of vibrant economy that will allow us to outcompete China and the rest of the world. My record of bringing people together and delivering results caused the U.S. Chamber of Commerce to recognize me with an award for bipartisanship last year, and the nonpartisan Lugar Center to rank me as the most bipartisan senator in the country. There is more work to do, and I'm looking forward to hearing about the issues that are front of mind for all of you. As long as I am your senator, I am going to work to find common ground and deliver solutions that move our state and our country forward. Thanks so much. I look forward to your questions.
Oh, that's just like a broadcaster keeping track of time. That's great. We're down to almost 2 minutes. Now let's go to the first question. It's question number 1. Inflation will be asked by panelist Matt Burdett. Matt?
Inflation is obviously at the top of the voters' minds as we head toward November the 8th. The country has not seen numbers this high in 40 years, and inflation is hitting our New Hampshire businesses especially hard. A two-part question. What do you think about the Inflation Reduction Act signed into law in August, and will it actually reduce inflation? And what else can the federal government do to reduce inflation?
Well, thanks for the question, Matt. And look, inflation is straining our families, it's straining our small businesses, to be sure. We have to continue the work of lowering energy costs, in particular, and then long-term we also need to address, obviously, the availability of housing and childcare, both of which are also driving inflation. To be specific here, in the short term, we have to help people with costs. So that's why I supported the negotiation provision that allows Medicare to negotiate prescription drug prices so that we can see those prices go down. Seniors will also see, starting in January, a cap on insulin prices for those on Medicare, $35 a month. That helps put more money in seniors' pockets. That provision also saves the federal government money, billions and billions of dollars over 10 to 20 years, so it's a deficit reduction too. The energy provisions, among other things, provide Granite Staters tax cuts for making energy efficiency improvements in their homes. Those tax cuts will start being available when you file next spring. We also need to continue to find other ways to lower costs. That's why I'm pushing to suspend the gas tax. That's a difference that my opponent and I have. That's why it's so important that in the Inflation Reduction Act, we have incentives that will help us move to a clean energy economy, lowering energy costs as we provide more competition to big oil and become independent from both big oil and foreign oil. So those are some of the things that we need to work on. Now, the Chips and Science Act also will help us reduce inflation, and I'm happy to talk about that act further, but among the other things, it increases the global supply of semiconductors. The shortage of those are one of the biggest drivers in inflation in consumer goods, and so that's why that bipartisan act, again, something my opponent and I differ on, he says he wouldn't support it, about 40 Republicans in Congress did. That's another way we can continue to lower people's prices.
Finish the sentence, which we just did. Thank you, Senator. Question number 2, workforce housing, will be asked by panelist Lucille Jordan. Lucille?
Thank you. We are hearing a lot from our businesses in recent months about the rising costs of rent in the state. and the near impossibility for renters to find available housing, vacancy rates are as low as 0.5%. What is the federal government's responsibility to incentivize workforce housing in New Hampshire?
Yeah, this is an issue that I hear about from businesses and individuals and families all across the state, including from renters right now who are seeing their rents go way up as they're struggling with other costs. A couple of things. The major source of what's referred to as low and moderate income housing incentives come from the federal level with something called the low and moderate income tax credit. And that amount, the amount of investment by the federal government in that kind of housing has stayed stagnant for a long time. So we could invest more in that to produce more housing, increase the supply, lower costs. But I also have a bill that I've just sponsored, which would really focus on what the challenge is in New Hampshire. It would produce a competitive grant program at the federal level so that workforce development, housing development entities here in New Hampshire could apply for funds to help them invest in that kind of workforce housing, so important to employers. And it would also do a matching grant. Last thing I'll say is that there was flexible funding in the rescue plan, and the state is now using that money towards workforce housing. So that's a really important step forward too. I hear about this all the time, not just because it's important to, people making ends meet, but as employers are trying to recruit employees, they're having a really hard time. If you recruit somebody from another part of the country where housing is a lot less expensive, they get here and they either can't find a place or they can't afford it. So it's really important that we pay attention to this closely and again help people with their other costs while we're getting at the root of this problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Question number 3. Workforce itself. The question will be asked by panelist Steve Chasey. Steve?
Lack of available workforce continues to be a major issue for New Hampshire employers of all sizes and in virtually all sectors. Are there ways the federal government can alleviate New Hampshire workforce challenges?
Thanks for the question, and yeah, I hear about this issue, and it's one that I worked on as governor. It's one that I continue to work on in the Senate. A couple of things. We have to make sure that young people can get the kind of training they need and the skill sets they need to work in today's economy. The CHIPS and Science Act, which I talked about a little while ago, bringing more advanced manufacturing back to New Hampshire and the United States. We're going to need more people with those kind of skills for advanced manufacturing, something that Nashua Community College has partnered with businesses to help provide. In the CHIPS and Science Act, we invest in workforce training with particular focus on STEM and manufacturing and advanced technology skills. We are trying to invest more and more, and this is what the federal government is particularly good at, in the kind of workforce partnerships that New Hampshire has actually piloted with support from the federal government. Community colleges partnering up with businesses, and so making sure that students graduate from community college a lot with skills that are aligned to the needs of businesses. The other thing that is really important is to make sure that students can get the skills and education they need even before they graduate from high school. So having high school classes that students can take that qualify them for college credit, that helps lower the cost of their overall college, lower the time they're in college, makes them available to the workforce faster. And lastly, I'm in favor of making Pell Grants available for apprenticeship programs so that, again, people don't have to go to college to use these Pell Grants. They can get support to pursue a trade and, again, get into the workforce much more quickly. Last thing is we just talked about workforce housing. We need to make sure that we have a better supply of workforce housing so more people can afford to be here and live here.
Very good. Okay, to question 4, energy. The question will be asked by panelist Matt Burdett.
According to New Hampshire's Business and Industry Association, New Hampshire electrical energy prices are nearly 60% higher than the nationwide average. Our businesses are facing a crisis in energy costs driven by a lack of available supply in our region. Such costs make it difficult for businesses and put New Hampshire businesses at a disadvantage. What is the federal government's responsibility in ensuring infrastructure and to reduce the overall cost of energy?
Thanks for the question, Matt. And yeah, energy costs are way too high. So I'll cover a couple of things again. Any way we can help people in the short term while we're also dealing with the long-term issues here is really important. So I'll continue to push for suspension of the gas tax. Again, that's just putting a little bit more money in people's pockets while they deal with other expenses. On the home energy front, the Inflation Reduction Act energy provisions are really important in the long term as they help us gain independence from big oil. Big oil is seeing record profits right now. They have additional supply that is available to them that they're not producing. So it's really important that we stop being so dependent on big oil and foreign oil and develop our own clean energy, something that we invested in the Infrastructure Act as well now in the Inflation Reduction Act. Now there is more we can do to help people with home heating costs this winter in particular. We just got another additional $1 billion nationwide to help people with home heating costs this winter. And I've led a bipartisan group of senators to push the administration to release more home heating energy fuel this winter to help people with those costs. As I mentioned, the provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act also give people a tax cut if they make improvements in home energy efficiency, even better insulated doors or windows, for example. So those are some of the steps we can take. I'm going to keep pushing the administration to consider making sure that they are doing everything they can to release more petroleum from the strategic petroleum reserves. And lastly, some of the infrastructure things that you are talking about tend to be more state issues because, of course, the state decides on the siting of this infrastructure. But that is something we have to work together on, making sure the infrastructure can get necessary fuel to people, but also do it in an environmentally responsible way.
And that was the end of the sentence?
Thank you.
Very good, okay. Now, question 5 is something dear to the hearts of many here in Nashua, and that's rail. Question will be asked by panelist Lucille Jordan.
Thank you. Indeed, and Senator, you just spoke to this a little bit earlier. Expanded rail is on the minds of New Hampshire businesses as a means to bring more workforce into the state each day. A rail study is to come out in January. Do you support rail expansion in New Hampshire? And do you see a path for the federal government to fund expanded passenger rail? How will you ensure federal funding to bring rail to New Hampshire happens?
Thanks so much, Lucille. I do support and have supported for a long time expanded rail in New Hampshire. I just have to give a shout out to all of you in Nashua and the Nashua Chamber because you guys have just been advocating for it so well, getting studies done, proving the case. The Capital Corridor project is something that I hope we can see to fruition. And when I was negotiating the bipartisan infrastructure bill, I was kind of the lead negotiator in making sure there is federal funding available now for states like New Hampshire with plans like the Capital Corridor project to apply for critical federal funding that will help bring this to fruition. There are 2 different provisions that I negotiated that give the state a couple of different approaches they can take to apply for funding. The last thing the infrastructure bill does with regard to rail is also support and fund an expansion of Amtrak, which would be another option of getting increased rail to the state. But we worked really hard to get those provisions into the infrastructure bill, knowing, we kind of looked at the Capital Corridor project, knowing about it, and tried to make sure that the provisions in the infrastructure bill will make it as straightforward as possible for New Hampshire to apply for those funds. There will be other entities, other states, other communities competing for these funds too. But I am very hopeful that New Hampshire's long-term planning in this regard, the advocacy of this chamber, and understanding the great impact it would have on this state in terms of bringing workforce here, it would open up our economy in so many different ways, alleviate some of our workforce issues, bring more young people to the state too. I think knowing how important those impacts are will put us in a very good position should the state decide, the state has to decide to compete for this funding.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, the final question to the panel is question 6, our U.S. borders. Will be asked by panelist Steve Chasey. Steve?
Migration across U.S. borders with Mexico and Canada, especially the U.S.-Mexico border, continues to be an issue that looks for a workable solution. While the borders differ significantly because of our long, close economic ties with Canada and the difference in numbers, there is migration growth across both borders. What is your position on fixing the broken immigration system, and what actions as our New Hampshire representative in the federal government will you take to fix this broken system?
Thank you so much, Steve, for the question. We have to have, and I know my mic is going in and out a little bit here, we have to have secure, safe, orderly, and humane borders. And so one of the things I have done throughout my time in the Senate is really touch base with the men and women at the front lines of our border, both southern border and northern border, about the security there and what they need. It is very clear in my multiple visits to the southern border that we need more personnel, we need more technology, and in some places we need more physical barriers. And one of the things I've worked on, because this is both about preventing people from crossing the border illegally, but also preventing drug trafficking, right? Because we know fentanyl comes up over the border. So we need more personnel. I voted to successfully fund that. We need more technology. I voted to successfully fund that, as well as fund specific technology to detect fentanyl and similar drugs at the border, working with both President Trump and President Biden to do that. We also know how important it is that we have a comprehensive bipartisan effort to reform our immigration system. I was part of a bipartisan group that worked on that in 2018. Unfortunately, that didn't get over the finish line, but we definitely need to come together as a country and fix this broken system. Last thing I'll just say is I have disagreements with my own party about this. I think we have to secure the border and have an orderly border before we can talk about doing things like lifting Title 42. Because we all know there's agreement that there will be a surge of migration when Title 42 lifts. And I think we shouldn't do that until we take care of the security provisions. Similar conversations at the northern border, but obviously some differences there too. And I'll finish right up. The trade relationship between New Hampshire and Canada is particularly special, so our northern border has to take that into consideration. Thanks.
Senator, we're now going to take some questions submitted by the audience, and they'll be handed to me by Wendy. Okay. And you'll have 2 minutes to answer each question, and the same questions will be asked of Don when he's up on stage. So let's do 3 or 4 questions. Here's one from Rita. How are you communicating with Granite Staters?
Oh, thanks for the question, Rita. A couple of ways. I do a series of roundtables, community visits, business visits I have throughout my time in the Senate as well as governor. I also find that people at Market Basket are not shy about approaching and talking to me when I'm doing my grocery shopping. We also do a weekly newsletter that my office produces. It's an email newsletter. People opt in to get it. You can find that at my website. But what I find is it's a mix of going and visiting businesses and schools, being out in the community, doing roundtables. Obviously, during the pandemic, some of those roundtables were virtual ones. But it's one of the best parts of the job, and one of the things I love about New Hampshire is just people will come up and talk to you. And when you think about the conversations you have, you then are able to turn those conversations into actual results that move the state forward. So just a great example, I began hearing from Granite Staters pretty soon after I got in the Senate about these surprise medical bills. You know, when you're insured and you go to an emergency room that's in your network and you are told it's covered, and then you get this surprise bill because a radiologist, for instance, wasn't actually part of the network and you had no way of knowing that. So So because Granite Staters talked to me about that, I teamed up with Republican Bill Cassidy, and now the practice of surprise medical bills, which was absurd to begin with, is banned nationwide. The law went into effect in January, and since January, 2 million surprise medical bills have been banned and not delivered in the United States. So that's the kind of thing that ongoing communication with Granite Staters helps us do. Similar about suspending the gas tax, similar about things like lowering prescription drug prices with Medicare negotiation.
Okay. And I've had that problem with surprise medical bills personally. Charlie has asked the question, where do you stand on two things in 2 minutes, climate and abortion?
Look, climate is the threat of extreme weather and climate change is real. I hear about it from businesses all the time. Everything from our ski slope operators to our travel and tourism industry to businesses over on the seacoast that are seeing sea level rise and flooding as a result. Something, by the way, we work to address in the bipartisan infrastructure bill. And it's taking a toll on our economy, it's taking a toll on our way of life. So that's one of the reasons the Inflation Reduction Act provisions that incentivize clean energy production is so critically important, while we also continue to make sure that we have adequate supply of energy during that transition. Look, on abortion, I think the government has no place in telling a woman what kind of decision to make in some of the most difficult, challenging, and intimate moments of her life. This is about a woman's fundamental freedom. It is about whether we are considered second-class citizens in the United States or not. So I will always stand for a woman's fundamental freedom. I will always stand for her right to make her own health care and life decisions without politicians trying to make them for her. I believe women have the capacity to do that. I believe we have the moral compass to do that. And I oppose a nationwide abortion ban, which is something clearly on the agenda in Washington and something that my opponent and I differ about.
Okay. Here's a question from Ted. What is the most pressing issue for you to deal with in the next session of Congress?
Lowering costs is number one on everybody's agenda. Continuing the work we need to do to lower energy costs. But then when you think about the other drivers of inflation here, we know housing is something we've talked a lot about, so getting the legislation that I just talked about over the finish line to help New Hampshire increase its supply of workforce housing, really important. Bringing down the cost of childcare. One of the things we know in New Hampshire and nationally is that there are people who want to enter the workforce who can't because they can't find affordable quality childcare. Another major source of workforce shortage is the lack of home and community-based care for people who are aging or people who have disabilities. So just for example, I think the data is there are about 6 million people nationally who say they'd be in the workforce, but they've got an aging parent at home or a family member with a disability, and they can't get the kind of home care that will make them feel comfortable leaving that family member while they're at work. That's why I'm a sponsor of something called the Better Care, Better Jobs Act, which would increase the supply of home and community-based care in our country. And that really promotes dignity, and it also promotes the capacity of people to work. A couple other things. We need to protect Social Security and Medicare. Again, something my opponent and I differ on. And we need to continue the work to bring more fiscal responsibility to the federal government. It's something I work on with Rand Paul on the other side of the aisle. We together have passed legislation that has saved the government a couple of $100 billion so far, and we need to keep working on that.
Okay, let's wrap the audience questions up with that. And Senator, 2 minutes for your closing statement.
Well, thank you again, Fred, for moderating, and for everybody here today for participating, and to the Nashua Chamber for sponsoring this event and making it happen. It's been the honor of a lifetime to serve the people of New Hampshire in the United States Senate. We know how critically important it is that we continue to work together as Granite Staters to make sure that we deliver results and move forward. I'm going to continue. I'm running for re-election because there is more work to do. We've talked about some of it today. Lowering energy costs, making housing and child care more affordable. I want to continue to be able to fight for innovators and entrepreneurs. I'm running for re-election to protect Social Security and Medicare and to defeat efforts to ban abortion nationwide. And that's really the choice here. The choice in this election is about whether or not we're going to continue to believe that the promise of our democracy belongs to everybody, and whether or not we are going to continue to believe that the best way to solve problems is by working together. As long as I am your senator, I am going to work to find common ground and deliver results. Because you don't solve problems with partisanship or extremism. What we do instead in New Hampshire is we roll up our sleeves, we unite as Granite Staters and Americans, and we get the job done. People in New Hampshire have been doing that now for over 200 years, and we can't give up on it. We're the live free or die state because we believe that a better future is always worth fighting for. I thank you for the opportunity to be with you today, and I respectfully ask for your vote. Thank you, everybody.